This is Ism, Season 2, The Age of Anarchism, Chicago and the American Labor Revolt. Ideas meet power. Prologue, Bread or Death. Paris, March the 9th, 1883. The cold lingered longer than usual that spring. To a passerby, it might have seemed like any other morning in Paris. The boulevards gleaming, the stations humming, commerce moving as if history had at last settled down. Nearly 12 years had passed since the Paris Commune, and to many, the city appeared healed. But that morning, something tense gathered beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides. The vast complex rose like a shrine to the French state. Cannons aligned in ceremonial rows. Murals of conquest stretched across cavernous ceilings. Statues of Roman gods frozen mid-victory. At its heart lay the tomb of Napoleon, the conqueror, the emperor, the embodiment of ordered power. By dawn, the surrounding barracks were already full. Infantry slept in their boots, cavalry horses stamped and snorted behind closed gates. The night before, orders had gone out quietly. There were rumors of a march. Hungry workers, radicals, agitators. The police did not intend to be surprised. Around midday, the crowd appeared. Thousands of workers poured into the wide avenues leading toward Les Invalides. Thin, shivering, shoulders hunched against the cold. Their coats were threadbare, their boots cracked. Hunger showed first in posture, then in the face. The police moved to meet them. Mounted officers advanced in formation, sabers at their sides, clubs resting across their thighs. The contrast was stark. Polished uniforms against rags, horses against bodies. The crowd slowed, then stopped. For a moment, neither side moved. Then a woman dressed in black stepped out from an alley near the square. She walked deliberately onto the cobblestones, her gaze fixed on the line of armed men ahead. A handful of others followed, also dressed in black, their faces hardened by prison, exile, and defeat. Louise Michel then climbed onto a wooden ladder so she could be seen above the crowd. "You have a right to be here," she called out, her voice steady. "If they charge, well, you know what to do." The horses surged forward. The crowd broke in all directions. People ran, stumbled, scattered down side streets and into doorways. Michel and her comrades shouted, pulled, directed, not towards safety, but toward power. Paul Mink led a group toward the Ministry of the Interior, revolver raised as she ran. Others disappeared into the Latin Quarter. Michel ran alongside the labor organizer Émile Pouget, 100 workers behind them. They spilled onto a street lined with bakeries and butcher shops, windows full of bread, meat, and cheese. Abundance pressed against the glass, inches from starvation. Michel darted into an alley. She grabbed a broken broomstick, and from the ground she pulled a scrap of black cloth, torn, dirty, and discarded. With quick strokes, she scrawled words across it: bread or death. She tied the cloth to the stick and stepped back into the street. The workers gathered again, breathless, hungry, watching. Michel raised the makeshift banner above her head. The black cloth hung ragged in the cold air, stark against the pale stone and polished windows. She moved first, the banner held aloft, and the crowd followed. Hundreds stumbled behind her. They did not walk for a program or even for a promise. They walked simply because they refused to stand still. Ahead of them, mounted police reformed their lines, sabers catching the spring light. Behind them, bakery windows shattered, bread spilling onto the street. And above it all, the black cloth twisted in the wind, fraying at the edges, threatening to tear loose from the broomstick as they moved, held together only by her grip and by the pressure of the crowd pressing forward. Hi, I'm Matt Payne, and welcome to Ism. This is What is Anarchism? Liberty's Great Refusal.
sans goutte de sang, mais je l'ai bien en cours, les dents de ses rires.
Louise Michel returned to Paris in 1880 after more than half a decade as a prisoner in exile in the French colony of New Caledonia, deep in the South Pacific. In the aftermath of the Paris Commune, she had witnessed the massacre and deportation of thousands of workers and radicals. She had spent years in prison alongside hundreds of other women. And in New Caledonia, she encountered the full violence of French colonial rule, siding openly with the indigenous Kanak during their revolt in 1878. By the time she returned to the City of Light, Michel was no longer the same revolutionary she had been in 1871. She quickly re-immersed herself in Paris's radical politics, drawing large crowds wherever she spoke. Her role in the Commune in her years of exile had only heightened her prestige. But the decade since the Commune's defeat had reshaped her politics. In exile, Michel, like many former communards, had come to believe that the struggle for liberation no longer lay primarily in capturing the state, but in rejecting it altogether. Indeed, it was in New Caledonia that she first began to call herself an anarchist. In the summer of 1881, Michel traveled to London, where a few dozen radicals from across Europe gathered to chart a new path for revolutionary socialism. The old one had collapsed. In the years following the Commune, the International Working Men's Association had fractured and dissolved. After Karl Marx and his allies expelled Mikhail Bakunin, James Guillaume, and the anarchist-leaning socialists, the organization split into rival internationals. Beset by internal division and relentless repression, neither survived for more than a few years. So the 1881 London Congress brought together a different generation, figures shaped less by doctrinal battles than by defeat, exile, and police violence. Among them were Peter Kropotkin, the geographer and emerging theorist of anarchist communism; Enrico Malatesta, a young Italian revolutionary hardened by years of exile across Europe, West Asia, and North Africa; and Marie Lecomte, the eccentric American journalist known for her writings on outlaws and insurrection. And then, of course, there was Louise Michel, her name still inseparable from the memory of 1871. The Congress produced no durable party, no unified program, no centralized organization. But its significance lay elsewhere. The London meeting marked the emergence of a new current on the radical left, one less concerned with discipline or strategy than with refusal. A politics shaped not by victory, but by repression, not by promises of power, but by a growing conviction that power itself was the problem. When Louise Michel returned to Paris, she re-entered her life of relentless agitation. She worked alongside fellow former exiles like Henri Rochefort and Paul Mink, organizing workers and leading public campaigns to secure amnesty for those still imprisoned or deported to New Caledonia. At the same time, Michel began collaborating with a younger generation of militants. Among them was Émile Pouget, a 23-year-old pamphleteer and labor organizer who would later help articulate the strategy that became known as anarcho-syndicalism, a vision of revolution that rejected political parties in favor of unions, strikes, and direct action by workers themselves. In March 1883, Michel helped launch a new wave of radical newspapers, including La Vengeance Anarchiste, the anarchist vengeance. Its pages brought together anarchist feminism, labor agitation, and debates over propaganda of the deed, a term popularized by the German revolutionary Johann Most to describe dramatic acts meant to expose the violence of the existing order. Just days after the paper's first issue appeared, Michel, Pouget, and Paul Mink helped lead a procession of hungry workers through Paris. Many were carpenters whose livelihoods had been undercut by the rapid introduction of industrial machinery. The city was staggering under mass unemployment, with tens of thousands without work as winter dragged on. The march began peacefully, but when the crowd reached the grand square before Les Invalides, They were met by overwhelming force. Police with clubs, infantry with rifles, cavalry with sabers drawn. Demonstrators were beaten, soldiers charged with bayonets fixed. The crowd scattered into the surrounding faubourgs. Michel and Puget led several hundred workers into the Latin Quarter. And it was there that Michel fashioned a banner from a broomstick and a scrap of black cloth. According to most contemporary accounts, this was the first time the black flag was raised explicitly as a symbol of anarchist revolt. Black banners had appeared before. As we saw last season, the Lyons silk workers had flown one during the Canu uprisings of the 1830s and 1840s. But it was Michel who transformed it in 1883 into a conscious emblem of the emerging anarchist movement. As the black flag moved through the streets, crowds began breaking into nearby bakeries, seizing bread the authorities had refused to ration. Within days, Michel and hundreds of others were arrested. And so, once again, she found herself on trial. And once again, she turned the courtroom into a platform. What she offered in her defense was not a legal argument or even a plan, but one of the earliest and clearest expressions of the anarchist spirit. Quote, "You find it strange that a woman dares to defend the black flag. We sheltered our demonstration beneath it because it is the flag of strikes, because it indicates that the worker has no bread. If our demonstration had not been peaceful, we would have taken up the red flag. But that flag now hangs over the tombs of our dead. When we raise it again, we will know how to defend it. I am not pursuing dynasties or governments. I am pursuing an idea. I would rather see revolutionaries in prison than in the ministries of state. There they serve the socialist ideal, whereas in power, one is seized by vertigo and forgets everything. The people are starving, and they don't even have the right to say they are starving. Well, I took up the black flag to say that the people were without work and without bread. If that is a crime, then judge me as you wish. Events themselves cause revolutions. If there are so many anarchists, it is because there are so many who are disgusted by the sad comedy our leaders have played for so many years. We want peace for humanity through the union of peoples. These are the crimes we have committed. Everyone is looking for their own path. We are looking for ours, and we believe that the day when the reign of freedom and equality arrives, humankind will be happy. For Louise Michel and her generation, anarchism was not chaos. It was clarity, a politics that emerged when authority had exhausted every claim to legitimacy, leaving only force on one side and the simple refusal to obey on the other. As industrial capitalism reshaped societies across the globe, this spirit of refusal would travel far beyond Paris. But it did not spread as an idea alone. It took root as a survival strategy in places where the pressures of modern life were most severe, among the starving and dispossessed, the excluded and forgotten. And nowhere were these pressures felt more acutely than in industrializing Chicago, a city of iron and smoke, a city of extravagant wealth and desperate hunger. And it was in Chicago that Lucy Parsons, a woman once described as the Louise Michel of America, first immersed herself in the struggles of American labor. And through her life and work, Parsons and her comrades would help bind anarchism to the labor movement, giving that spirit of refusal a new and powerful form. Interlude: Making a Living, Chicago, 1879. Sewing a wedding dress felt strange to Lucy Parsons. The white brocaded lace glared beneath her coffee-stained fingertips. The summer air turned the needle warm in her hands. Steam lifted from the iron and vanished against the tin ceiling. Her back ached constantly now. She shifted in the chair, crossed her legs, then gave up and stood. Balancing the dress against her pregnant belly, she used her body as a work table, buying herself a few moments of relief she knew would not last. She stitched steadily, counting them without meaning to. When she reached a dozen, she sat again and reached for the newspaper on the table beside her. The Socialist. The title ran bold and black across the top. The paper was soft with use, creased and smudged from being folded and unfolded too many times. After thumbing through the pages once more, she set it back down on the bench beside her. The wooden frame was still warm from the factory seamstresses who had gathered there just hours earlier, listening to her and Lizzie speak. She smiled at the thought of Lizzie. They had only met a month ago, but already she felt like a sister. Outside, the street carried the dull noise of summer. Carts rattling, voices rising and falling, the distant whistle of a factory ending its shift. Red and gold light scattered through the workshop window, each ray struggling to push through the smog beyond the glass. Across the narrow street, a crowd of men stood hunched in filthy brown coats. The same men as the day before, the same as a week before, all begging for work, all willing to accept any wage at any condition. Lucy glanced down at the paper once more. She felt faintly vain for how often she had returned to these same lines. But it steadied her, knowing that her name, her words, were there. Somewhere beyond this room, they might already be moving, passing hand to hand, read aloud, carrying something larger than herself into the city pulsing just outside. As the sun slipped behind brick and stone, Lucy set the paper down, picked up her needle, and went back to sewing. Anarchism first emerged in Europe as a critique of power. In Chicago, it arose as a strategy for how to confront power. Across Europe, from Paris to Moscow to London, anarchism initially took shape as a moral and political philosophy, sharpened in exile, debated in congresses, and articulated in courtrooms. But in the rapidly industrializing United States, it became something else. In the workshops of New York, mines of West Virginia and Colorado, and factories of Chicago, anarchism was forced into practice. It had to answer immediate questions. Who controls property? Who commands labor? Who decides wages and how people can survive when the state appears not as a guarantor of rights, but as an instrument of violence? Lucy Parsons' career as a radical writer, labor organizer, and itinerant speaker would span over half a century, unfolding amid a time of immense social transformation. Chicago, in the late 19th century, when her work began, was a city defined by upheaval. In 1877, the Great Railroad Strike brought Chicago's transportation network to a standstill as thousands of starving workers clashed with private police forces and federal troops. Less than a decade later, in 1886, the city stood at the center of a nationwide general strike, as nearly 500,000 workers across dozens of industries walked off the job to demand an 8-hour workday, a movement that would culminate in the Haymarket Affair and the execution of Lucy's husband, Albert Parsons. And it was in the space between these two upheavals, between the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 and the Haymarket Affair of 1886, that Lucy and Albert Parsons began calling themselves anarchists. For the Parsons and their fellow labor agitators, figures like August Spiess, Samuel Fielden, and Lizzie Holmes, anarchism was a loose and often unstable identity, shaped by strikes, repression, and daily struggle. And it is precisely this fluidity that offers a crucial insight into what anarchism meant to those who fought beneath its banner in the late 19th century, not as a theory inherited from European intellectuals, but as a politics forged inside the conflicts of a rapidly industrializing world. One of the most striking features of anarchism as a social movement is that its core principles, strategies, and even its many internal currents rarely emerged as blueprints for a future society. Instead, they took shape as attempts to describe and make sense of struggles that had already unfolded, efforts to name, explain, and draw lessons from forms of resistance after the fact. This reversal of cause and effect distinguishes anarchism from many other political traditions. It helps explain why anarchism never fully hardened into doctrine, and why it has remained unusually adaptable, capable of evolving alongside new struggles rather than prescribing them in advance. At its core, however, anarchism is held together by a simple commitment to taking the promise of liberty seriously. As the historian Peter Marshall has put it, anarchism is, quote, like a river with many currents and eddies, constantly changing and being refreshed by new surges, but always moving toward the wide ocean of freedom. Because of this broad yet steadfast commitment to liberty, anarchism has often been retroactively discovered nearly everywhere, in ancient philosophy, religious heresies, and Enlightenment dissent. But the anarchism that concerns us here was not a timeless philosophy. By the late 19th century, anarchism was a mass social movement, rooted in industrial capitalism, urban labor, and repeated confrontation with the modern state. This movement, the one that emerged from the American labor revolt of the 19th century and that shook industrializing Chicago, was not an inheritance from antiquity or a mere extension of Enlightenment liberalism. It was born from hunger, repression, and the simple refusal to obey. With that in mind, we can now trace some of the main currents of anarchism as a social movement, which emerged in the 19th century, always remembering that these ideas were not predictions of the future, but attempts to make sense of struggles already being fought. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the first currents of modern anarchism emerged in revolutionary Paris. As we noted last season, the first thinker to explicitly describe himself as an anarchist was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Trained as a philosopher and political economist, Proudhon's central contribution was his identification of property, not poverty, not ignorance, but property itself, as the primary source of exploitation. In this, Proudhon gave voice to a broader critique already circulating among radical thinkers and workers alike, that bourgeois property ownership, enforced through rent and capital, distorted social relations and concentrated power in the hands of the few. But where others often stopped at moral condemnation, Proudhon pushed further. He called not for the reform of property, but for its abolition. By claiming that property is theft, Proudhon did not mean the personal possession of land, tools, or goods necessary for life. Instead, he drew a sharp distinction between use and ownership, between what people needed to live and what sat idle, generating profit through the labor of others. This radical critique would lead Proudhon to an even more unsettling conclusion. Property, he argued, could only survive through force. Courts, parliaments, tax collectors, and above all, the police, all existed to defend the claims of owners against those who actually produced society's wealth. From this followed his most infamous provocation. Quote, "The only way to organize democratic government is to abolish government itself." When asked what would replace it, Proudhon answered simply, nothing. So, in claiming the title of anarchist, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon also gave the movement a foundational insight, that capital could not survive without the coercive machinery of the modern state. For the next generation, this opened up a deeper and perhaps more dangerous question. For if power was what enforced capital, then how could any form of power ever be trusted? Mikhail Bakunin answered bluntly, it could not. Mikhail Bakunin spent much of his life as a revolutionary, perpetual exile, and labor organizer, moving through the fault lines of 19th century Europe, Moscow, Paris, Prague, Warsaw, Dresden, Geneva, wherever national uprisings and class struggles erupted. Toward the end of his life, after his expulsion from the First International and the collapse of his attempts to build a new anti-authoritarian workers' movement, Bakunin distilled his thinking into two works that would shape anarchism for decades to come: Statism and Anarchy in 1873, and God and the State, published in 1882. These works were forged in defeat. The violent suppression of the Paris Commune in 1871 and the mass execution of thousands of communards by the Third French Republic convinced Bakunin that the state was not merely corrupt, but irredeemable. As he put it, quote, "No state, however democratic its forms, not even the reddest political republic, is capable of giving the people what they need. The free organization of their own interests from below upward, without any interference, tutelage, or coercion from above." Writing amid the bitter infighting of the First International, Bakunin directed this critique not only at monarchies and bourgeois republics, but at socialism itself. He warned that even a so-called workers' state, like the one envisioned by Karl Marx and his allies, would inevitably reproduce domination. Or as Bakunin put it more sharply, quote, "It will scarcely be any easier on the people if the cudgel with which they are beaten is called the people's cudgel." Mikhail Bakunin died in 1876, characteristically while plotting one final insurrection in Bologna, an effort uncovered by the authorities and ending, like so many before it, in failure, arrest, and exile. Yet his influence would endure. He left behind a generation of militants who carried his vision of collectivist anarchism and spontaneous revolt into struggles across the industrial world, from Chicago to Petrograd to Barcelona. But Bakunin's legacy also posed a problem. His philosophy was forged through confrontation rather than construction. He taught anarchists how to resist power, but offered fewer answers about how people might organize without it. One of his most famous lines captured the dilemma. Quote, "The passion for destruction is also a creative passion." But for the next generation of anarchists, that passion was not enough. They would take Bakunin's spirit of revolt and ask a much harder question, not only how to destroy domination, but how people might live, cooperate, and survive in its absence. The figure who would most forcefully attempt to answer that question was Peter Kropotkin. Like Bakunin, Kropotkin was born into Russian nobility. And also like Bakunin, he broke decisively with that world. But where Bakunin's anarchism was forged in insurrection and exile, Kropotkin's emerged from observation. Trained as a geographer and natural scientist, Kropotkin spent years traveling through Siberia and northern Asia, studying both human societies and the natural world. As a scientist working in the shadow of Charles Darwin, Kropotkin initially approached his studies expecting to find struggle and competition. But what he found instead was cooperation. Again and again, among peasants, indigenous communities, and even animal species struggling to survive in harsh environments, Kropotkin observed that the defining feature of life was not domination, but mutual aid. For Kropotkin, the Darwinists who increasingly influenced social thought in the late 19th century were fundamentally wrong in their assertion that survival depended on competition. Instead, Kropotkin argued that it depended on cooperation, on shared labor, collective care, and informal networks of support that functioned without central authority. This insight led Kropotkin to a radical conclusion. For if cooperation was not an exception within nature, but one of its dominant tendencies, then anarchism did not require heroic self-sacrifice or permanent revolt. It required creating the conditions under which people could do what they already did instinctively: support one another. Kropotkin developed these ideas while working with the Euro Federation, the anti-authoritarian wing of the First International stationed on the French-Swiss border. There, amid decentralized unions and worker associations, he encountered living examples of modern human organization without hierarchy. Not utopias, but imperfect, functioning alternatives to state power. Out of this experience emerged what came to be called anarchist communism. The idea that goods and resources should be distributed according to need rather than labor output, and that social life could be organized through voluntary cooperation rather than coercion. So, where Bakunin had taught anarchists how to resist power, Kropotkin tried to explain how people might live without it. For Kropotkin, anarchism was a wager on human nature, on the idea that communities, once freed from hierarchy and constant surveillance, would not descend into chaos, but would organize themselves more cooperatively than power had ever allowed. In industrializing Chicago, this wager would be tested under the harshest conditions imaginable. In Chicago, anarchism was forced out of theory and into daily life. And few places better reveal how anarchism has always grown strongest where power appears most nakedly and violently. The anarchists of Chicago, Lucy Parsons, Albert Parsons, August Spiess, and Samuel Fielden, were first and foremost militant labor organizers. They embraced anarchism not because it offered a utopian vision of the future, but because it described the reality they already faced. For them, power was not abstract. It appeared in arbitrary arrests by a corrupt police force, in the violence of private militias deployed to crush strikes, in a hostile press openly aligned with industrial capital, and most of all, in the daily exploitation of factory floors, workshops, and tenements. Ideas mattered to them, but only insofar as they clarified how to confront that power. This emphasis on practice also helps explain a persistent distortion in how anarchism has often been remembered. Because while public attention has often fixated on isolated acts of spectacular violence, assassinations, bombings, and individual acts of defiance, the anarchism of Chicago was defined far more by collective action. Strikes, mass protests, boycotts, mutual aid networks, and the slow work of organizing were the movement's real center of gravity. Chicago demonstrates how anarchism was rarely something done by lone figures acting in the shadows. Instead, it was something built openly, collectively, and at great personal risk, in workplaces, on picket lines, and in the streets. As activists immersed in daily practical struggles, Chicago anarchists drew freely from multiple traditions and showed little concern for the doctrinal schisms that had fractured the First International. From Karl Marx, they took the language of class struggle. From Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and Mikhail Bakunin, they absorbed a deep suspicion of authority and the state. And from American radicals, from the civil disobedience of Henry David Thoreau to the moral urgency of John Brown, they inherited the conviction that injustice demanded action, not patience. Out of these conditions and influences, a new strategy began to take shape, one that would, by the turn of the 20th century, transform anarchism from a critique of power into a mass movement. At the time, it was known simply as the Chicago idea. Later, as it spread across the industrial world, from Paris to Petrograd to Buenos Aires, it would come to be called anarcho-syndicalism. Anarcho-syndicalism rests on a simple but radical premise, that industrial unions could serve as the nucleus of a new federated society. Power would no longer be centralized but dispersed, exercised horizontally through networks of workers bound together by voluntary cooperation and mutual aid. Contracts would be upheld by shared interest and collective strength, not enforced by the state. In this vision, the general strike came to mean more than just shutting down factories and railroads. It meant demonstrating, all at once, that the daily functioning of society depended not on laws or governments, but on the coordinated labor of workers themselves. For anarchists, workers, and labor organizers across the industrial world, anarcho-syndicalism appeared to resolve a dilemma that had long divided the socialist left. From the earliest days of the First International, radicals had wrestled with how to organize workers in ways that could confront and ultimately overturn capitalism without reproducing domination under a new name. Anarcho-syndicalism seemed to offer a provisional answer. Solidarity within and between unions provided the organizational foundation. The general strike supplied a revolutionary horizon. And day-to-day actions like strikes, boycotts, mutual aid, and when necessary, sabotage, allowed workers to fight for immediate improvements while avoiding the dangers of party politics and parliamentary systems many had come to distrust. Although anarcho-syndicalism would later be named and theorized by Émile Pouget, the French activist who had marched with Louise Michel in March 1883, Pouget himself insisted that anarcho-syndicalism emerged not as a European theory, but as a strategy first practiced by Chicago labor activists. As he later wrote, the general strike had been imported from the United States, quote, fertilized by the blood of anarchists hanged in Chicago. Anarchism in Chicago was rarely an abstract theory. Instead, it was a way of organizing life under pressure, collective, confrontational, and openly hostile to the institutions that governed industrial society. And then, what took shape in Chicago would not remain there. As industrial capitalism spread, the methods forged in its struggles traveled with it, taken up by workers across Europe and the Americas, in the mines of Canada, the factories of Barcelona, the rail yards of Paris, the ports of Buenos Aires, and the industrial districts of Russia. So, of all the many forms anarchism would take, it was anarcho-syndicalism, the Chicago idea that industrial unions could provide the embryo of a future free society, that gave it its broadest and most enduring social base, transforming anarchism from a critique of power into a lived collective practice for millions of workers. Epilogue: The American Commune, Chicago, November the 27th, 1884. The bitter winds of winter had already reached Chicago by Thanksgiving in 1884. That day, thousands gathered in Market Square as sleet drove across a mass of workers, huddled together like patches of brown snow. At the front of the gathering, a makeshift speaker's platform, assembled from discarded wooden pallets, had been erected for the day's speeches. Above it rose two ragged flags, flapping sharply in the icy wind. One blood red, the other midnight black. Outsiders who happened upon the demonstration were struck by its unexpected warmth. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Brewers and coopers rolled out barrels for sitting and drinking. Much of the day passed in song. Nearly all of Chicago's best-known labor organizers spoke: Albert Parsons, Samuel Fielden, and finally August Spiess, who ended his speech by pointing to the black flag and declaring that the day marked the first time the anarchist banner had flown over American soil. Between songs, speakers rose to denounce the evils of industrial capitalism, while celebrating the power of collective action. They spoke of solidarity across lines of nationality, race, and gender, weaving economic statistics together with moral and religious condemnation. The final speech was delivered in German by Michael Schwab, who ended with 3 cheers for the social revolution. Then the crowd began to march, with Lucy Parsons and Lizzie Holmes at the front, carrying the red and black flags aloft. As they moved through the city, their chants echoed off the polished facades of Chicago's business district. Down with wage slavery. Working men unite. Liberty without equality is a lie. The procession eventually stopped before the home of a prominent politician and diplomat who had once publicly denounced the revolutionaries of Paris in 1871. A man stepped forward, pointed upward, and called out, "3 cheers for the Paris Commune." The response came at once, "Vive la Commune." A band then struck up La Marseillaise, and the march continued through hunger and laughter, sleet and song, carrying the memory of revolution through Chicago's gilded streets. By the late 19th century, Chicago was a city of contradictions. A place where tycoons strolled past beggars, where marble towers rose over crumbling tenements. It was the fastest-growing city in the world, promising opportunity while also producing staggering inequality and widespread misery. It was within this environment that anarchists like Lucy and Albert Parsons, Lizzie Holmes, Samuel Fielding, August Spiess, and Michael Schwab began to attract a following among the city's working poor. The Thanksgiving gathering of 1884 at Market Square marked a symbolic turning point. In the years following the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, labor organizers increasingly staged large public demonstrations where thousands of workers, along with their families, gathered to celebrate, organize, and display their collective strength. These events were often held on national holidays such as July 4th, Christmas, and Thanksgiving, what labor organizer William Holmes once described as, quote, capitalistic holidays. The aim was not only protest but reclamation, transforming official rituals of gratitude and patriotism into shared acts of solidarity marked by speeches, songs, banners, and drink. And perhaps no occasion carried greater meaning than the anniversary of the Paris Commune. At these annual gatherings and at demonstrations throughout the year, working people sang La Marseillaise and shouted Vive la Commune, invoking not a distant European episode, but a living example of what collective power could look like. Agitators like Albert Parsons spoke openly of the need for an American commune, which he described as the, quote, revolt of labor against the domination of capital. So, the Thanksgiving gathering of 1884 was part of a well-established tradition within Chicago's working class, where mass demonstrations displayed solidarity, joy, and collective strength. But what set that day apart was that alongside the red flag of socialism now flew the black flag of anarchism, a visible sign that anarchist organizing had now moved out of the margins and into the center of the city's labor movement. Indeed, that same year saw the launch of Albert Parsons' newspaper, The Alarm, while August Spiess took control of the German-language paper Arbeiter Zeitung. Together with Lucy Parsons, Lizzie Holmes, and Michael Schwab, these organizers helped spread anarchist ideas and strategies across Chicago's working-class neighborhoods, among native-born workers and immigrants alike. By 1884, anarchism in Chicago was no longer a marginal philosophy. It was a movement, organized, visible, and increasingly confident in its collective power. Within a year, as the economy faltered once again, that confidence would help fuel a nationwide struggle for the 8-hour workday, with Chicago at its center. But before we reach that moment, we need to turn to the event that first convinced Chicago's radicals that society could be transformed through a great refusal, the mass refusal to work. In 1877, as unemployment soared, starvation spread, and inequality deepened, tens of thousands of workers across the nation would walk off the job, demand a living wage, and bring the nation's transportation network to a grinding halt. It was the moment America's working class first discovered its collective power, and the moment the state revealed just how far it was willing to go to destroy that power. So join me next time as we return to Chicago, 1877, for the Great Railroad Strike.
Mais je l'ai bien cru, les temps desserrés, roulant sans vêtements, puis mon rêve du pendant de rêve. Ça risque d'errement, heureux ça pareil, tout bon sur les mous, sans goutte de sang, mais je l'ai bien cru, les temps desserrés.
Ism is written and produced by me, Matt Payne. The original musical score is composed by Ian Payne. Our theme song is performed by Aloe Vera on vocals and banjo, with accompaniment from Ian and myself. If you're curious how I build these narrative scenes, where I source the quotes, what lines are verbatim, altered, or composed to capture the essence of a moment, you'll find full transcripts, suggested readings, show notes, and behind-the-scenes looks at my process on the ISM Substack. The link is in the episode description. To learn more about Ian's work, you'll also find his website there. And if you'd like to reach out, you can email me at ismhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next time.